Record. Okay, so for this first problem, we have x squared minus 12x plus 11. So you group up your first two terms, or like your x squared and your x part. So I usually just rewrite it below, like put parentheses around it. But you want to leave a little bit of space. We'll see why in a second. And then the plus 11 just stays on the outside of the parentheses. So to turn this into vertex form, we have to do something called completing the square. Completing the square is where you take your b coefficient, you cut it in half, and then you square it. So like in this problem, we would have our b is negative 12, so negative 12 over 2 squared. I mean, that would be negative 6 squared, or you would just get 36. So that's what we put in this spot here. We're going to add a 36, but you can't just add a 36 to an equation without any kind of repercussion. You have to kind of balance it out. So if we add a 36, we're going to subtract a 36 on the outside, because that would basically not be changing the problem. I mean, you can add 10 and subtract 10 and you're back to where you started, kind of thing. So to simplify this, one tip is like you're going to have a perfect square trinomial. And if you're a little bit rough with your factoring, like I said, we'll look at this more at the end of this week. But this would be x minus 6 squared. Basically, whatever number you get inside here is what you'll have inside your binomial. So since it's a negative 6, it's a minus 6. But if you remember, like from factoring, like negative 6 times negative 6 would give you 36. And then negative 6 plus negative 6 would give you negative 12. Oops. And then plus 11 minus 36 would be negative 25. So this is our vertex form. If they ask for your vertex, remember you change the sign of the inside number, and your outside number stays the same. So like you just pull out your h and k from this formula. Recording again. So for number 2, one thing you always want to be able to look out for is if you have a coefficient with your x squared. So like, for example, we have a 2 in front. So we still want to group up our two terms, but we gotta factor out this 2. I don't know if you've ever pulled out a GCF, but like if you pull out a 2, you basically got to divide everything in this parentheses by that. So we would just have x squared minus 4x, and the 6 I'm not messing with it. So if you have a coefficient, you basically want to factor it out. Oops, let's try to get the same color. I'm just screwing up all the colors here. It was this one. But if you pull out a 2, you basically divide everything by 2. But now then it's like a problem like we saw before. So if you have a coefficient, you always want to try and factor it out. But now we would use this as our b. So we'd have negative 4 over 2 squared, or negative 2 squared equals positive 4. So I'm going to put a plus 4 inside my parentheses. But here's where we got to be a little bit careful. Since this really isn't a plus 4, if you think about it, if I distributed my 2, like that's really a plus 8 I added to this equation. So to undo that plus 8, I'm going to subtract 8 on the outside. So if you have a coefficient, be careful when you're like canceling out what you put in, because if you have a coefficient pulled out in front, when you put a plus 1 or a plus 2, a plus 3 or plus 4, or whatever you put inside that parentheses, it's really different than what you're writing. Like if you distributed that coefficient back in. So now we can factor this. So I'm just going to keep the 2. I'm going to have x, and like I said, whatever you get here is what you're going to have inside this binomial, or this two-piece expression. So then we'll just combine our outside. So 6 minus 8 would be minus 2. So this would be our vertex form. So if they ask you for your vertex, I mean, you would pull out your h from the inside, which would be +2, and then your k from the outside would be a -2. So you always switch the sign of the inside part, outside part stays the same. How about questions